Thank you, Professor Deutsch. I thought you, as an economist, you're going to quote Clinton of saying, it's the economy, stupid. And
well, this is a political science.
yes. Okay. I'm going to speak now about one aspect of American foreign policy, especially during the last administration, during the current administration, and I call it linkage politics, although I'm going to start with more linkage policy. As you know, the BESE Center is more oriented to policy than to theory. I'm going to start with a historical context of, everything today is history. Somebody said not only the future is not what it used to be, even the past is not what it used to be. So, but still, I'm going to start with a historical context of this concept, of this policy of linkage, and then explain what it means more in a little bit more details. And then I'm going to finish by showing that in the second Obama administration, there is a reversal of that policy, which is based on the same logic, but it's not the same. As you can see, President Obama, upon entering the White House, proclaimed that the problem of nuclear Iran, and he knew that Mr. Netanyahu was very sensitive. I mean, he started with the nuclear threat even before being prime minister, is linked to a solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what was the rationale? That if you want to advance and mobilize the Arab countries against Iran, then Israel must solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, or at least show some advancement there. As you know, this resulted, we're talking here about the United States president, and two responses. One I didn't put here. The first one was that Mr. Netanyahu in this university, chose this university, and the BESE Center, and for the first time, for a Likud prime minister to say that he's ready to accept a two-state solution. The second one was, again, revolutionary for a Likud prime minister, and that was a 10 months freeze on settlements that no previous prime minister, even from labor, never had or dared to accept such a freeze. And here you had the Palestinian response, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, who negotiated with, who had negotiated already with Olmert, even on core issues. He didn't even want to meet Netanyahu until a month before the freeze was about to be terminated, and we all know what happened after that. Why is it important to talk about it? What is linkage? Linkage, the origins are from maybe some of the, not the youngsters, but of my generation still remember that it started with Henry Kissinger, when he announced in Congress that the United States will have a linkage policy, and it means that the Soviet Union, in the negotiation with the Soviet Union, there'll be a linkage between salt, which they knew that the Soviet Union is interested in, and local conflicts. In other words, if the Soviet Union will behave responsibly in Vietnam and in the Middle East. That was the rationale. In other words, what in labor relations, some of you may know, is called a package deal. Iskat Havila, we call it in Israel. When you make a package deal, you say, okay, we have a settlement on all aspects. And as we all know, it broke down. The first crack came during the Yom Kippur War, when immediately the outset of detente, when the whole thing broke down. South Vietnam was conquered in Vietnam, and here the Soviet Union stood behind Egypt and behaved irresponsibly. Wow. Then, okay, I'm going to skip, and then it came the Carter administration, and then the President Reagan, and all of it broke down. Why am I concentrating on it? Because I feel, and I'm talking about the first Obama administration, there was some false rationale in this linkage between a Palestinian settlement, yes, and the Iran question. As we see, the Sunni Arab leaders, yes, were pressuring Obama, yes, to come out. And this came out, this we saw. I mean, it's not something that we have to theorize about. The WikiLeaks discoveries, they divulged that most of the prominent Sunni Arabs leaders have repeatedly urged the United States to stop the Shiite Republic, meaning Iran, from acquiring nuclear weapons, regardless of the Palestinian issue. So there was some bluff under it, behind it. Yes, that if we will agree on solving the Palestinian issue, it will be easier to mobilize the Arabs against Iran. And if you want proof to it, I mean, just yesterday, as you know, the Saudi king didn't even want to go to Camp David, regardless of the Palestinian issue, because he is very upset at what is going to be now apparently the settlement, the deal, what's called the nuclear deal between the United States, or the 5+1 powers and Iran. But what more is important, I think, is that it is a inconsistency. In other words, what I'm saying is, when you say, okay, everything is linked, yes, you cannot ask Netanyahu to say, but you must fractionate, which is the opposite of linkage, the negotiations. In other words, you start dealing with the territories and forget the core issues, yes, which will, Jerusalem, refugees, this will deal later on. In other words, what's good for me, what I'm demanding for you, is not good enough for you. You must negotiate, first of all, with on borders. And my third point is, and this is, I think, something that I'm surprised so far nobody noticed. In the old days, labor and the Israeli left always said, okay, and this is started in 1967, territories for peace. In other words, if you give up, the big deal will be that we're going to have peace and we're going to exchange them for territories. And Likud said, no, if you remember those days, always the right wing said, no, peace for peace. In other words, don't link territorial withdrawals with a peace, because if the Arabs want peace, we'll agree for peace. Now, and this is, I think, the big false new episode. Here is when the Likud is already ready and says, okay, we'll exchange territories for peace, suddenly comes out the new ideas. No. First of all, you have to give up territories, and then we'll talk about the peace. Because how is there going to be peace without Jerusalem, without refugees and recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and so on. And here I'm turning to the new Obama policy, and this is, I think, where I think is my real major point. What happened is, as we know, that essentially the linkage thing collapsed, and President Obama's policy towards Iran implied the acceptance of the Islamic Republic into an international community without any nuclear disarmament. Well, I think I skipped something, I'm sorry. Yes. And what we see now, and that is what a reverse linkage, and that's what I think is the new Obama administration's foreign policy. Obama realized that during his administration, and everybody knows it, during the next 18 months, there's not going to be an Arab-Israeli peace. So he started now what's called the reassessment threat, policy of the U.S.-Israeli relations. But is most important here is that he, I think, is now pressuring Israel and he's going to do it harder now, from now on. He's pressuring Israel on the Palestinian issue in exchange of some less pressure, less Israeli intervention in Congress against the Iranian deal. In other words, what we see here is a reverse linkage. If in the first administration Israel was supposed to go for negotiations and then the US will go for a deal, now we see the opposite. He wants a deal. He knows that there's not going to be a peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but he's going to pressure us in exchange for this that we should leave him alone more with the domestic politics, with especially our influence in Congress. So what I'm trying to say is that the Obama real aim is to stop Israeli meddling in U.S. domestic politics on Iranian forthcoming agreement, which brings me, and this is my final point, which brings me to a new concept which is called linkage politics. And linkage politics is something that was developed in the 1960s, 1970s, which says that domestic and international politics are overlapping. In essence, in our case study, we have two linkage politics in front of our eyes. The Iranian agreement, the Iran agreement, has intervened domestic and international dimension, as we know. Congress, the big issue today is Congress in the United States, not Iran, I think. That was the main problem of Obama. And on the Israeli side, we also see a linkage between the Palestinian process and domestic politics. But this, as I said, is a side issue. If I had time, I would go into it. I know I don't have time, so let me get to some conclusions. My first conclusion is, therefore, that linkage in international politics requires uniformity and reciprocity. You cannot do it while demand from the other side that he should go for linkages, for a package deal, yes, while you're demanding from him also at the same time, okay, you want a deal, you have to separate the two. You have to separate the two issues. First of all, be ready to negotiate on borders, and then try to go for the other for the big issues. I think this is not going to work. It's unfair. It doesn't make sense. And as we see, it didn't work also during the Kissinger years because the Soviet Union's behavior, yes, during the Nixon administration, then the Ford administration, and after it was, okay, we want salt, but we're not going to agree to control the local conflicts or intervention in Vietnam. Vietnam failed, Yom Kippur War broke out, and that's why it didn't work. You cannot do this. If you go for a package deal, you go for a package deal. And you have to be consistent and responsible, and you have to have a reciprocity. And my second, which I didn't have time to go in, but I'm ready to expand on it during the QA period, that is that domestic and international politics cannot be separated. We know that in this issue of Iran and the Palestinian issue, there is domestic aspects, there are international aspects, and I think this is proof to an old wisdom that domestic politics is important, and we all know that in democracies, yes, like the United States and Israel, you cannot ignore domestic politics. And the ultimate thing is, that I thought about it today, is something that I'll be ready to hear from my colleagues, is that no, we have now a very weak government. 61 majority is a very weak government. Well, it's not healthy not for Netanyahu, it's not healthy for Israel. You always need, Israel is used to have big majorities government. Maybe the good part of it will be that it's very difficult to pressure a weak government. And especially if that weak government falls, we're going to have a new election which will bring us very close to the end of the Obama administration by the time we have some result. Thank you.